Day after day, it became clear that she was carrying the emotional burden by herself. The heart of the story rested entirely on her shoulders, not only within the script, but in real life as well. Years later, when she reflected on the experience, her words were measured, yet unmistakable. She never attacked him directly or used sharp language, but her meaning was impossible to miss. "We were meant to portray two damaged souls learning how to love," she once said, "but I was doing it alone." That single sentence revealed both the emotional gap on screen and the personal toll it took behind the scenes. Tommy was not openly aggressive. There were no dramatic confrontations or obvious acts of mistreatment. Yet indifference can wound more deeply than outright cruelty. It quietly tells someone they are not worth engagement. For an actor who pours her entire being into her craft, who builds performances on honesty and emotional truth, that kind of detachment slowly erodes confidence in ways that are subtle but deeply damaging. By the end of the project, Sally was emotionally exhausted. She had given everything she had, yet the silence she faced created a wall no technique or preparation could break through. The moments she hoped would feel raw and genuine instead rang hollow, missing the shared connection that allows performances to truly come alive. After Backroads, she never shared the screen with Tommy Lee Jones again. Though she rarely spoke about it publicly, the experience stayed with her. It reminded her that even in a world filled with bright lights and constant attention, emotional coldness can extinguish the best intentions. She didn't leave the film harboring bitterness, but she did leave with clarity about what she required as an artist. Respect, authenticity, and emotional availability were not optional extras. They were essential. And when they were missing, the silence that followed wasn't merely uncomfortable, it became defining. James Woods, the master of psychological pressure. Some actors challenge their scene partners in ways that elevate everyone involved. Others turn that challenge into something oppressive. What should have been an enjoyable, light-hearted production became a mental endurance test for Sally Field, forcing her to question not only her role but herself. Kiss Me Goodbye was designed as a whimsical romantic comedy, meant to offer relief after heavier projects. Sally entered the production hopeful and energized, eager to embrace its playful tone. Instead of collaboration, she found herself trapped in an unspoken struggle with a co-star whose actions seemed driven by control rather than support. James Woods had a reputation for sharp intellect and intensity. On screen, that often resulted in compelling performances. Off camera, however, Sally encountered behavior that felt isolating and dismissive. Rehearsals turned tense and unpredictable. Rather than building scenes together, Woods openly analyzed the script in front of cast and crew, questioning decisions, altering dialogue, and offering criticism no one had asked for. Sally's approach to acting relied on instinct and emotional exchange, and this constant intellectual sparring created an immediate divide. She wasn't simply performing her role, she was protecting her creative space. Moments meant to feel light and engaging instead carried an undercurrent of quiet superiority. Woods later left her with the impression that every interaction was a test she was never meant to pass. That psychological pressure extended beyond rehearsals. Between takes, he would suggest she wasn't fully invested or imply she was merely going through the motions, especially during emotionally intense scenes. These remarks were not constructive. They struck at her sense of worth. For a woman who had spent years fighting to be taken seriously in an industry dominated by men, the impact was profound. Each day of filming became something she dreaded. It wasn't the dialogue or the blocking that weighed on her, it was the constant mental resistance. While other collaborators had encouraged her growth, Woods left her feeling as though she had to continually prove herself. No matter how strong her performance, the unspoken message remained unchanged. It was never enough. What hurt most was how different this experience felt compared to her earlier work. Sally was no stranger to difficulty and had developed resilience over time. But this wasn't normal creative tension. It was a gradual breakdown of trust. There were no explosive arguments or dramatic confrontations, just a steady pattern of subtle undermining that caused her to doubt her instincts, her abilities, and her place within the production. Later, she described it not as a professional hurdle, but as something deeply personal. She wasn't struggling with the role itself. She was surviving a dynamic that diminished her. And when filming ended each day, the emotional weight followed her home, draining the joy from what should have been a fun and uplifting project. She left that film with more than fatigue. She gained a clearer sense of her boundaries. She resolved never again to accept behavior disguised as brilliance when it came at the expense of others. From that point on, she became more selective, not just about the script she chose, but about the people she worked with. Kiss Me Goodbye may have been labeled a romantic comedy, but for Sally, the experience held nothing romantic at all. It taught her the importance of standing firm against quiet disrespect. James Woods never shouted or openly insulted her, but the emotional residue of how he made her feel lingered far longer than any line of dialogue. Robert Blake, the embodiment of chaos. Some productions fall apart slowly, while others collapse before they ever find their footing. One of the most emotionally draining chapters of Sally Field's career came from a project that never reached the screen. What was intended to be a powerful television film instead dissolved into disorder, driven by instability that could not be ignored. Say Goodbye Maggie Cole offered real potential, a role that highlighted Sally's strength and depth as an actress. She arrived committed and prepared, ready to give the story everything she had. Very quickly, however, the environment became volatile, largely due to her co-star, Robert Blake. Blake was known for an intense, immersive acting style, but alongside that intensity came unpredictability. Rehearsals were erratic from the beginning. He frequently ignored the script, improvised without warning, and introduced behavior that hadn't been discussed or agreed upon. What others might have called creative freedom felt to Sally like disruption. Each scene felt unstable. Would he follow the script? Would he erupt emotionally? Would a carefully planned moment survive the take-it-all? The strain extended far beyond their scenes together. Blake's volatile moods affected the entire set. Accounts from the production describe frequent yelling, angry outbursts, technical disputes, and confrontations over trivial matters. Some days he was cooperative and calm. On others, the tension became so intense that filming stalled completely. Sally stepped into an unspoken role, becoming the emotional stabilizer not only for her character, but for the entire production. She tried to maintain calm, support the crew, and salvage each workday. But the more she tried to hold everything together, the more depleted she became. Eventually, the project unraveled entirely. Delays piled up. Rewrites failed to restore order. Morale collapsed. The chaos at the heart of the production could no longer be contained. The network ultimately abandoned the film, and it was never broadcast. Publicly, it was labeled a failed project. Privately, for Sally, it felt like emotional trauma disguised as employment. She later described it as one of the most distressing experiences of her career, not because of the lost opportunity, but because of the emotional turmoil she endured just to get through each day. There are actors who simply perform, she once said, and then there are actors who need to diminish others to feel powerful. To her, Robert Blake belonged firmly in the latter group. What unsettled her most was not just the tension, but the unpredictability. At times he could be gentle or even kind, which only intensified the anxiety. Those moments felt like the calm before another storm. She never knew which version of him would arrive on set, and that uncertainty destroyed any chance of trust or creative partnership. She left Say Goodbye Maggie Cole carrying far more than disappointment. She carried emotional exhaustion, the pain of a lost project, and a firm resolve. Never again would she accept dysfunction masquerading as talent. Skill alone was no longer sufficient. Kindness, stability, and mutual respect became her standards. In Hollywood, some stories remain untold not because they lack value, but because they collapse under the weight of one person's chaos. Sally never forgot what happened on that set. Though the cameras never captured the finished film, they left behind a lasting lesson about what she would never allow again. Dustin Hoffman, the silent saboteur. In an industry that thrives on collaboration, even an audition can become a battlefield of power. For Sally Field, What should have been the beginning of a promising new project instead became one of the most discouraging moments of her career, one that never even reached production. She had been invited to audition for a leading role in a film that seemed like a natural progression for her. The project stalled in development and faded from memory, but the audition itself stayed with her. The chemistry read paired her with Dustin Hoffman, an actor celebrated for his bold choices and commanding presence. Sally entered the room prepared and open, ready to explore the material together. What she encountered instead was an environment dominated by control. Before she could begin, Hoffman was already joking with producers, questioning the script, and asserting his opinions. The space was no longer collaborative, it revolved entirely around him. Once the reading began, the situation deteriorated further. Hoffman repeatedly interrupted her performance, not to explore the scene, but to critique her delivery and correct her choices in front of others. These weren't directorial notes, they were power plays. Sally later described the experience as humiliating. Despite being an accomplished, award-winning actress, she was made to feel inexperienced and diminished. Rather than being treated as an equal, she felt scrutinized and judged by someone who had already decided the outcome. Afterward, she learned through a mutual contact that Hoffman had joked about deliberately undermining the chemistry read, stating that the connection wasn't there because he ensured it wouldn't be. For Sally, this confirmed that the discomfort she felt had been intentional. She spent days questioning herself before realizing the truth. The issue was never her performance. It was an environment shaped by dominance and control. Over time, that clarity brought peace, but the memory remained. The experience sharpened her awareness of how easily power can be abused in creative spaces. It reminded her that confidence, even for seasoned artists, can be fragile when someone manipulates the room. She and Hoffman never worked together again, never shared a film. Yet that brief encounter left a lasting impression. As she later reflected, it wasn't rejection that hurt most, it was the cruelty. Turning a space meant for possibility into one designed to make someone fail. From that moment on, Sally trusted her instincts not just about roles, but about environments. She chose projects defined by respect rather than dominance. Because in Hollywood, the strongest performances begin where artists feel safe enough to be fully seen. Some truths remain hidden not because they're false, but because telling them requires courage. Sally Field's career is not only a story of talent, but of resilience, dignity, and reclaiming her voice. These experiences didn't define her, but they shaped the boundaries she refused to cross again. From pain to perseverance, she carried it all with grace, and eventually with honesty.